August 1942. On the bridge of a Japanese destroyer running the Tokyo Express at 28 knots, Commander Kohei Hanami swept the darkness with his binoculars and found nothing worth his guns. His lookouts, the best night eyes in any Navy on Earth, reported the sea empty. Below decks were troops and rice for the garrison, and ahead lay another delivery the Americans seemed unable to stop. When intelligence briefings mentioned the enemy's new torpedo boats, small wooden speedboats built by a yacht company, the wardroom had its joke ready. Plywood boats, boats for sportsmen. One officer said the Americans had sent their rich men's toys to fight the Imperial Navy, and the bridge laughed quietly in the dark. What Hanami didn't know was that 400 yards off his beam, low in the swell, with their engines muffled to a mutter, 4 plywood hulls were already tracking him down the barrel of the night. And what no officer laughing in that wardroom could have imagined was where the joke would end. Within 2 years, Japanese destroyer captains would refuse to linger in confined waters after sunset, and their crews would have a new name for the wooden toys: devilboats. Within 2 years, the largest night ambush in naval history would open with those same plywood hulls, and a fleet of battleships would follow them into the dark and not come out. This is the story of the smallest warships America sent to the Pacific, and of how the ocean's night watches changed hands. The mockery was honest. That must be said first, because everything that followed grew out of it. The boats the Japanese laughed at were 80 feet of layered mahogany and marine plywood, built by the Elko Boat Company to a design descended from pleasure craft. They carried no armor of any kind. Their 3 Packard aircraft engines burned 3,000 gallons of 100-octane aviation gasoline, which meant a single hit anywhere aft could turn the whole boat into a fireball visible for 10 miles. Their main weapons were 4 torpedoes hung in tubes along the deck, torpedoes designed a generation earlier, and a crew of about a dozen young men, many of them yacht club sailors and college oarsmen, none of them regular Navy. Against them stood destroyers of 2,000 tons with 5-inch guns and the finest torpedoes in the world. Senior American admirals doubted the little boats almost as much as the Japanese did. The plywood boats had exactly 2 assets. They could run past 40 knots, and they were very, very hard to see. The first proof of what that was worth came before the mockery even reached its height. In March 1942, with the Philippines falling and Japanese ships and aircraft hunting every exit, General Douglas MacArthur, his wife, his young son, and his staff were carried out of Corregidor through 560 miles of enemy-held water at night by 4 plywood boats under Lieutenant John Bulkley. No battleship could have made that run. No aircraft could have lifted them out. The most wanted man in the Pacific escaped. The greatest Navy in the Pacific aboard a boat the enemy considered a joke, and Bulkley wore the Medal of Honor for it. The boats had announced, quietly, what they were for: not fighting the enemy's strength, slipping through it. Guadalcanal turned the announcement into a campaign. From October 1942, a handful of boats operating out of Tulagi went hunting the Tokyo Express itself, and the night waters off the island became their workshop. The method never really changed. Idle in the blackness, close inshore, engines throttled to a whisper, wait for the destroyers to come down, the slot on schedule. Fire the spread, then run behind a smoke screen at 40 knots while 5-inch shells chased the wake. Here the record demands honesty. The early torpedoes were poor, slow, short-ranged, and prone to failure, and the young crews claimed far more hits in those wild midnight melees than Japanese records support. The plywood boats did not sweep the Express from the sea. What they did was worse and slower. They made every run a fight, every delivery a gamble, every confined strait after dark a place where a captain of the Imperial Navy could no longer be certain the night belonged to him. There's one decision from those nights I keep turning over, and I want your read on it. You command a destroyer worth 2,000 times the enemy boat, and doctrine says press on with the delivery, while every instinct says turn and destroy the ambushers. In the comments, tell me which order you would have given. Now, in August of 1943, one Japanese captain chose his answer at 34 knots, and it made the joke about plywood boats come true in the cruelest way possible. That captain was Kohei Hanami. In the black early hours of the 2nd of August, 1943, in Blackett Strait, his destroyer Amagiri came down on a patrol line of torpedo boats, and one of them, PT-109, appeared under his bow too close for guns. Amagiri ran the little boat down at full speed and cut it in half. Plywood against 2,000 tons of steel, the bow of the destroyer barely felt it. Gasoline flamed on the water as Amagiri raced on, and her crew, looking back at the burning wreckage, could be forgiven for thinking the wardroom joke had just been proven at sea. 2 of the boat's crew were dead. The 11 survivors clung to the floating bow section in the dark. Their skipper, a thin 26-year-old lieutenant from Massachusetts, towed his burned engineer by a life jacket strap clenched in his teeth, swimming 4 hours to an islet, then swam on alone through the night with a lantern to hunt for rescue, and finally sent his message out carved on a green coconut shell, handed to 2 Solomon Islanders. His name was John Fitzgerald Kennedy. The man the Plywood boats could not keep alive that night would one day be President of the United States. The Imperial Navy had cut the joke in half, and history would spend the next 20 years putting it back together. And while it happened, the fear was already spreading. Through 1943 and 1944, the boats gave up on their unreliable torpedoes for much of their work and grew guns instead, and they turned on the enemy's barge traffic, the nightly convoys of Daihatsu landing craft that fed every Japanese garrison from New Guinea up the Solomons. The Plywood boats destroyed them by the hundred, close inshore, in water no destroyer dared enter, and the garrisons behind those barges began simply to starve. And the hunters kept improving in ways the hunted could measure but not match. By 1943, the boats carried radar sets small enough for a plywood chart room, and a crew that had once strained its eyes against the same darkness as the enemy could now watch a destroyer's blip crawl across a scope from miles away, hold their ambush until the geometry was perfect, and fire on a ship their lookouts had never seen. The Imperial Navy answered the only way it could, sending float planes down the moonlit lanes to hunt for phosphorescent wakes and dropping flares over suspected ambush water, and the boats answered that by learning to idle in the shadow of shorelines where no pilot could pick varnished mahogany out of the jungle behind it. Japanese soldiers' diaries recorded the sound of Packard engines in the dark the way earlier wars recorded artillery. Prisoners repeated the new name their fleet had coined, the devilboats, and destroyer captains who had once laughed in their wardrooms now hugged the deep channels at night and cleared the straits before first light. The boats had no armor, they had the dark, and by 1944 the dark was theirs. The final proof came in October 1944 in Surigao Strait, on the last night battleships ever fought battleships. As Admiral Nishimura's force steamed north into the strait, the first Americans it met, hours before any gun spoke, were 39 Plywood boats strung along both shores in the blackness. They attacked in sections, wave after wave, boring in through searchlights and shell fire to launch and run, and their contact reports drew the map of the oncoming fleet for the fleet waiting at the top of the strait. A torpedo from PT-137 crippled the light cruiser Abakuma, which was sunk within days. And when Nishimura's battleships finally cleared the gauntlet of boats and destroyers, they arrived, blind and battered, exactly where the American battle line was waiting to destroy them. The Imperial Navy lost 2 battleships and the strait before sunrise. The door to that ambush had been held open all night by boats built of mahogany and plywood, crewed by boys the Japanese fleet had been taught to laugh at. The accounting closed quickly after that. America built more than 700 of the boats and lost 69, more of them to weather, reefs, and friendly aircraft than to Japanese guns. When the war ended, most of the survivors were judged not worth shipping home. Sailors stripped them on a beach in the Philippines, stacked them, and burned them by the dozen, a bonfire of mahogany that had helped win the night war of the Pacific. The crew stood on the sand and watched their boats burn, and more than one veteran wrote later that it felt less like scrapping equipment than like losing a shipmate. But the story refused to burn with them. In 1960, as Kennedy campaigned for the presidency, a letter arrived from Japan. It was from Kohei Hanami, with captain of Amagiri, offering his congratulations and his respect to the man he had run down in Blackett Strait, and the two former enemies corresponded until Kennedy's death. The coconut shell with the carved rescue message sat on the president's desk in the Oval Office, and it sits today in his library in Boston. In 2002, the explorer who found Titanic, Robert Ballard, found what was left of PT-109 on the floor of Blackett Strait, and veterans of the boats stood witness as the cameras passed over her torpedo tube in the silt. 2 restored boats survive at Battleship Cove in Massachusetts. 80 feet of varnished mahogany, and visitors always ask the same thing: how something that small and that wooden fought the Imperial Navy. In 1942, Japanese wardrooms asked it as a joke. By 1944, their destroyer captains asked it in the dark with the engines they could hear but could not find closing in from the shoreline. The Plywood boats never got armor. They never needed it. The night was theirs, and the Imperial Navy never took it back. Tonight you have seen the whole arc of a joke, from a wardroom laughing at Plywood to a battleship fleet following those same boats into an ambush it never left. Every story I trace here ends the way this one did, followed all the way down to the coconut on the president's desk. Subscribe to Frontline Echoes, and you will never have to wonder how the story ended.